I would call this sort of third audience the curious and connected audience. Hi, I'm Amy Nelson. I'm the Senior Marketing Strategy Manager for Classical and Jazz at FUGA.
Hi, I'm Sascha Braunreuther and I'm a sales and label marketing manager at Naxos Music Group.
So today we're hoping to dive into talking about classical audiences and the kind of fandom within the classical genre. And obviously the term fandom is quite uh, a strange word for us. We don't usually use that, but definitely how do we reach new audiences within classical? So what do you what do we kind of think the audiences are within the classical community?
Yeah, that's always something that we've been discussing a long time. To me, there's sort of, I guess there used to be two. I think we're now talking about three segments of the audience, so to speak, where we have a more traditional audience that, is mostly engaging with classical via from a very familiar standpoint, via their expertise, and just being engaged with the genre for a long time, where
Yeah,
they know the repertoire, they know their favorite artists already, they know where to look for the music that they like and
yeah,
likely will enjoy without having to rely on, so to speak, on algorithmic suggestions or
yeah,
things like that, right? From the DSP
yeah.
side.
They'll be more likely to take recommendations from Gramophone magazine or BBC Radio 3. Yeah, I guess we kind of identify that core classical audience as older, more maybe educated, wealthy. They're going to prestigious concert venues. They know the repertoire. They know the composers. They've been probably leaning in for a very long time and consider themselves sort of experts of the genre. They probably, engage with classical on formats such as SACD and vinyl and have money to spend on like high-end audio equipment. So yeah, that's definitely for a very long time, I think, been the core classical audience. And I think, it's definitely true what you say, there is more than one audience. We've also got the passive audience. So, where that core classical audience, I think we would consider them maybe slightly older. We've got the passive audience who are maybe more sort of millennial, older Gen Z, younger Gen X, who are listening to classical in the background while they're working, they're sleeping, they're cooking, and usually they're engaging with classical via like really well curated playlists offered by the DSPs. And they don't want anything else other than to listen to whatever's being recommended to them. They don't want to have to like lean in any other way. It's just a very passive sort of experience. But you mentioned potentially a third audience.
Yeah. So where I see this sort of, I mean, at least in classical, I see it as a newer audience that's emerging, where that third audience, so to speak, that sort of is most comparable to what I would call to an engaged pop music audience, where they sort of discover the music more by following artists or engaging with artists and the music via, social media, via things like YouTube, maybe, other website presence that an artist might have on the internet, as well as their DSP profiles, if that applies. And so it's sort of the pipeline where I would that I would tend to see more in the pop space, I would say.
Yes, definitely. I would call this sort of third audience the curious and connected audience. As you say,
Very nice.
I think they're connecting with the classical genre on TikTok, on Instagram, on YouTube, and I think they are impressed by what they're hearing, by what they're seeing. They're impressed by the virtuosic nature of the genre, rather than feeling overwhelmed by that or put off by that. Because I think until now, maybe some people are like, oh, these people, they're so talented, but I don't understand the culture. I'm not intellectually cultural enough to understand what's going on. This audience are saying, wow, what is this? Who is this? This is incredible. What an amazing sound. What a talent. I want to know more about who this artist is. I look back at like last year's Eurovision Song Contest winner, JJ from Austria, who is a classically trained countertenor, for example, and also Rosalia, who with her Lux album, which is recorded with the London Symphony Orchestra. Like these are impressive sounds that this younger audience are intrigued and impressed by. And yeah, I definitely think this is the new audience that classical should be trying to target and like bring into their world.
Yeah, that includes the aforementioned artist focus sort of that we spoke of, right? Like the artist in a I don't know, Web 2.0 sense, if that's what people still say, where where there's actually someone to with an interesting story that you latch onto for one reason or another,
Yes.
and follow them, actually engage with them, and make sure to not miss anything that they release or anything that they have going on, whether it's in the live sector, whether it's a recording that's upcoming and things like that.
Yes. Yes, exactly. Um, so how do we think these new listeners, this new audience are discovering and engaging with classical music, and how are artists adapting their approach in response?
That's a really interesting question. And like I mentioned, I feel like this is where the genre is getting closer to the popular music genres when it comes to that, because, people seem to engage with the artists that share authentic experiences, like you already touched upon, where there's actually the emotional connection to their audience via the music, be it
Yeah.
their own or be it by, a composer that they truly love. And I think that's something that's especially from the projects that have been working from my experience recently, that I've seen more and more is where people actually talk about their investment in classical music, not necessarily in terms of, oh, I spent thousands of hours of practice, because that's part of it, but also I did it not for fun. I don't sit there and practice violin for fun. I do it because I love this music. That's a really
Yeah.
interesting aspect of it.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think listeners are really, as we've already said, like this audience is discovering classical music and classical artists now via these digital platforms. So, namely TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube. And I think artists are now adapting to that by, engaging with those mediums and, saying, okay, like, yeah, maybe, we don't need big budgets. We don't need professional edits to be able to make this kind of content. We can still make engaging and impressive content just by sitting in my studio while I'm practicing the piano, and I can make a quick 1 minute short for YouTube, or I can make something quick for TikTok and like, really do something informal whilst retaining that kind of authenticity and and creating that emotional story that they want their audience to connect to.
Fully agree. Fully agree.
Yeah.
Um, I think, what it comes down to for me, however, Amy, is, I've been working with classical labels, occasionally with artists directly in various capacities. In the beginning more with the physical medium, now with the digital space, and I've been doing this for almost 10 years now, which feels mad
Right.
to say,
Yeah.
but with everything that's changing so rapidly, be it on the DSPs, be it on the social media platforms, my question now is, what can labels and artists that we work with learn from all of what we're discussing here, right? Both in terms of quick wins, but also, in terms of broader and more long-term strategy.
Yeah. The quick wins is a really, for me, that's really interesting because actually it doesn't take a lot to really position yourself well on social media and use the digital marketing platforms that are available, such as like the tools on Spotify, Instagram, and YouTube, things like this. So I think the quick wins would be, you know, make sure that your profiles are optimized, they're verified, you're updating your profile pictures, you've got consistent profile branding across the different platforms. Make sure you're doing, consistent social media scheduling, even if it is just something really informal, just yeah, as I mentioned before, just some kind of like just playing the piano from like your bedroom or your living room or something at a train station, just something really fun but authentic. to post on social media, and to also make sure that your marketing language is not too academic, it's not too dry. Like, make sure that when you're promoting yourself as an artist or you're promoting your classical release, that you're using language that is relatable, it's personal, it's emotional, because we want to bring audiences in, we want to make sure that we're, delivering that ability to connect, for the audience to connect with the artist. And I think generally, like, the broader lessons that we can learn from this is it's not, I think within the classical industry specifically now, it's not so much about releasing repertoire. Up until now, as we've mentioned, the classical industry is very much about, you know, producing, recording, releasing repertoire. And I really strongly believe that probably most things by now have been recorded and released. It's now about how do we build a relationship with audiences. We've already got the core classical older generation, they're well taken care of. The passive listener who just wants to listen to classical in the background, they've got, amazing playlists that they can engage with. But how do we connect with this new audience? And again, I think it's more about, making sure that that artist now has a voice, because yes, the music should speak for itself. The artistic ability should speak for itself, and it should, and it will always continue to do so. But let's also empower the artist to connect with their audience in a real, authentic, and in an emotional way. And I think for labels, that means, helping artists to develop their own identities on digital platforms. So, help them with a good social media content plan, encourage them to use their social media. Don't be afraid of failure, to experiment, to try things, to not think, oh, um, social media, audience strategy, all that sort of thing, that's just for the pop artists. That's not for me. No, it's also for classical artists, it's also for classical labels. And we're seeing, a really well developed social media schedule can bring real proven results.
Yeah, yeah. And you can adapt it in a way where you're not devaluing anything. You're adding
Exactly.
to it. You're adding to it, right? You're adding
Yeah.
to it by offering your interpretation. And if people feel a connection to why and how you're interpreting that music, and sometimes you will have to explain that, of course, then I think, yeah, it adds to it rather than takes anything away. Totally agree.
Exactly, exactly. We're not saying that a social media, a good social media strategy or good digital marketing is the only way to break a classical artist these days. Like, absolutely not. And as we've already discussed, like, this conversation is so huge for classical. Like, how do we apply this to an orchestra? How do we apply this to a choir, to an
Totally
ensemble?
different, yeah.
To Gregorian chant, through to all different subgenres. It's a huge conversation. But for the artists who are able to position themselves on social media and on the digital platforms, I think it's actually a really valuable tool just to add to their arsenal and to their, just their overall release strategy.
Yeah, totally agree. And we've seen, again, like you mentioned, we've seen responses on that as well. It's not just us talking, we have examples that this has worked really well for the artists in a longer term fashion and
Yeah.
for the projects themselves as well.
Yeah, exactly. I think the question now is, how can the wider music industry bridge the gap between classical music's traditional perception and that modern need for, like, personal branding and fan engagement? How do we, I guess, balance authenticity with growth?
I think we've touched on that already, but I can't stress this enough. I think it has a lot to do with people expressing their love for what they are doing to the
Yeah,
audience, in a way where it's no longer just the repertoire, and it's no longer just the composer, but it's truly the story of these artists
yeah,
who are deeply in love with that music, and having people and sharing their love with the audience, as cliche as it might sound, but I feel like that's how we can go about making sure that there's both a sense of the importance of all the tradition in classical practice, but at the same time also reaching audiences that don't necessarily have the background or the expertise to fully grasp all those, more traditional values in the music, I would put it, I guess.
Yeah. I think it's definitely about authenticity, but from the industry as a whole, I think it's about transparency and it's about education. And I think the wider industry needs to bring classical into its conversations more. I think the challenge is that the wider industry needs to create an environment that makes it possible for the classical genre to do this. We need to be giving artists the confidence and the resources and the knowledge to experiment with social media, with digital storytelling, content creation, providing guidance on how to communicate authentically and create engaging content and to celebrate, the genre and all of its nuances. And I also think as well that so within our classical industry, we need to be talking more transparently to each other about our challenges and opportunities within our classical industry, but also to take those conversations to the wider industry so that we can lean on the wider industry's knowledge as well for support.
For sure. We do see, of course, that being a relatively niche genre, that our unique challenges often aren't really taken as seriously or talked about with a seriousness, I would say, from the wider industry, and that's something that definitely also needs to change, in my personal opinion. And
Yeah.
that goes back to making sure that we all together, be it artists, labels, everyone, try to have that wider conversation.
Yeah. Have that wider conversation and be transparent and be confident about it. Definitely.
Yeah, with all the unique, opportunities and challenges.
Yeah. Yeah. So today we've been talking about classical music and, and fandom, audience growth. We've talked about the different classical audiences. We've touched on the core classical audience, the passive classical audience, and this new third audience who we call the curious and connected audience. And we've talked about how that audience is discovering and engaging with classical music and how artists are adapting their approach in response. We've also talked about what labels and artists can learn from this. We've touched on some quick wins. We've also touched on some broader lessons that we can learn. And we've discussed how the industry can bridge the gap between classical music's traditional perception and the modern need for, yeah, personal branding. So I think we can wrap that up there. Thank you so much, Sasha.
Thank you very much, Amy. Always a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you. You too.